Good day. Today is Sunday, 6th April 2025, and we continue to see the reverberations of the new world of tariffs, which was introduced last week by the US President Donald Trump. Now, I'm not going to discuss tariffs very much at all in this program, but I am going to quickly discuss the situation in Britain. I've noticed that already there's been anguish in Britain about the future of the British car industry there. I mentioned in a previous program that British car makers, particularly the famous ones, Land Rover, Bentley, Rolls-Royce, export substantial proportion of the cars they make to the United States. Land Rover has already announced that in light of the tariffs that have been imposed on its cars, it has, for the moment, paused all exports of cars to the United States. Articles are starting to appear in the British media about how the Trump tariffs could devastate what's left of the British car industry. Anyway, in the meantime, I've also had some pushback, or at least some comments, about a description I gave of the British Prime Minister a couple of days ago, maybe a program or so ago, in which I said that he comes across to me as a strange cross between a non-entity and a fanatic, or something like that. And some people thought that was altogether too unkind to Keir Starmer, and rather more thought it was perhaps not hard enough, harsh enough. Anyway, I mentioned I'm going to return briefly to this topic today because over the last couple of hours, Keir Starmer's office has been busy telling everybody that the era of globalization is over and that he is the person who's going to lead Britain out of this era of globalization that we have all experienced. We've had comments by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, a major figure in the British cabinet, Duran Jones. He says the following: people should be prepared for things to be tougher in the global economy. Globalization has come to an end in the wake of the new tariffs. Asked if the era of cheap fast fashion or cheap TVs was over, Jones said, yes, it's ended. Globalization, as we've known it for the last number of decades, has come to an end. It is in the best interest of the British economy and workers to get trade deals across the line, and he still hopes that there's going to be some kind of tariff agreement with the United States. Why the British persist in thinking that Donald Trump is interested in granting them special favours, I've never been able to understand. Why Keir Starmer imagines that he has some close relationship with Donald Trump, I also cannot understand. Anyway, returning to the topic of Keir Starmer, he has chosen to write an article in the Daily Telegraph outlining his vision of the future, if one can call it that, and the way in which he proposes to pilot Britain through the problems that the new tariffs, the new world of protectionism, the end of globalization herald. And it's interesting, by the way, that Keir Starmer always chooses the Daily Telegraph, a rather right-wing newspaper that traditionally backs the Conservative Party in which to publish his articles. He's not the only British cabinet minister to do that. Anyway, put that aside. The article, its title reads, "The world as we knew it has gone. Nobody wins from a trade war. My government will champion the voice of British industry on the international stage." My government, by the way, is, or would once have been considered a major breach of protocol. The government of Britain, properly speaking, or constitutionally speaking, is not Keir Starmer's government, it is the King's. The King is the person who appoints the ministers, including the Prime Minister, the King's First Minister, and the Prime Minister conducts the business of the King's government in the House of Commons. At least that is the the British constitutional theory, of which, somewhat surprisingly, given that he is a lawyer, Keir Starmer seems to be ignorant of. Anyway, let's move on. And, well, we will see how pragmatic and unlike my description of him as a non-entity, a cross between a non-entity and a fanatic, Keir Starmer actually is, because the first paragraphs of his article read as follows. First, it was defence and national security. Now it is the global economy and trade. Old assumptions can no longer be taken for granted. The world as we knew it has gone. We must rise to meet the moment. We are ready for what comes next. The new world is less governed by established rules and more by deals and alliances. An admission that the rules-based international order that we've been hearing so much about is in its dying days, just to say. But anyway, he then goes on to say this, and it was a sentence that really stood out for me. It demands the best of British virtues, cool heads, pragmatism, and a clear understanding of our national interest. Cool heads, pragmatism, and a clear understanding of our national interest. And then, after those words, the words that talk about cool heads, pragmatism, and a clear understanding of our national interest, what does he talk about? Does he talk about steps to protect the car industry, attempts to forge economic relations with other countries around the world, attempts to restart negotiations with Donald Trump to see whether there can be a relaxation of tariffs in British favour, other steps to change or alter or recalibrate the British economy in a way that would address the major challenges which his first words appear to recognise. Why not at all? What topic does he, in fact, immediately turn to? You guessed it, Ukraine. Look how we've responded to Russian aggression in Ukraine. We have stood firm in support for Ukraine. We've convened world leaders. Which world leaders? And worked with our international allies. We've boosted our defence spending, the highest sustained increase since the Cold War, not just for the lasting peace of Ukraine, because it's vital to the security of the United Kingdom. Remember, this is supposed to be an article in which Keir Starmer addresses the challenges, the economic challenges that Britain faces. But what is clearly at the forefront of his mind, the thing he immediately comes to, his priority, if you prefer, isn't that at all. It's Ukraine, it's the cause of Ukraine, because Ukraine is vital, or so he believes, to the security of the United Kingdom. Is that a case of cool heads, pragmatism, and clear understanding of the national interest? I can't see how. I can't see in what possible way it can be. If you want examples, if you want an example of cool heads and pragmatism and clear understanding of national interest, well, why not actually turn to that previous British Prime Minister that people like Starmer endlessly invoke. After all, Churchill, known to be a virulent anti-communist for most of his political life, well, the moment he heard that the Soviets and the Germans in 1941, after Operation Barbarossa, had come to battle with each other, he immediately said that Britain would stand by the Soviet Union, would stand by Russia. And he made a speech in which he said that he wasn't taking back anything he'd said about communism, but that Russia's cause was also Britain's cause. And famously, he quipped that if the Germans had invaded hell, he would still have found some nice things to say about the devil in the House of Commons. Now, that was real pragmatism, one that addressed the crisis of the moment. I can't see any sign at all of pragmatism here in what Keir Starmer is saying in this article. And by the way, I'm not going to waste my time with all the other parts of the article. If you're expecting to find in it any real program, any real plan about how to address the enormous problems that Britain now faces, you won't. You'll find all kinds of things about turbocharging the future, improving domestic competitiveness, creating situations to expose us less to global shocks, maximizing local skills, talents and opportunities, an absolute Praetorian phalanx of cliches marching across the page. So, I repeat what I said before. A non-entity crossed with a fanatic. It seems to me to describe him exactly. I am sorry, very sorry, to say this about the Prime Minister of my own country, but I cannot see that any other description will do. Anyway, let's now turn to that other conflict, the conflict in Ukraine, which is so much at the forefront of the British Prime Minister's mind. There have been more comments, by the way, over the last couple of days, last couple of hours, from various European leaders, basically all of them commenting about how the whole idea of Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing really is premature, and it appears all to be running out of steam. Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, a man who is, as I said, as ardently hostile to President Putin of Russia as it is possible to be, more so perhaps even than Keir Starmer himself, he's now increasingly coming round and saying that the whole idea of sending European troops to Ukraine has been brought up prematurely. It's not the right moment even to discuss this subject. It should be put back until the moment comes when there is an agreed ceasefire, and then, and only then, will it be the right moment to start this whole discussion. Now, Stubb spoke a couple of days ago about the necessity for the Europeans to propose a leader, an individual from amongst themselves who would conduct the negotiations with the Russians, who would open up discussions with the Russians. And I said previously that this had been earlier floated by the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, at one of the meetings, those interminable meetings that the Europeans have, one that was chaired by Emmanuel Macron in Paris. This led to a furious row between Sanchez and Kaja Kallas, the European High Representative for Foreign Policy. Mrs. Kallas came back and said that, if there's going to be a representative to conduct negotiations with the Russians, well, since she was the High Representative of the European Union, that person obviously should be her, and that it made no sense to suggest or propose anyone else. Apparently, Sanchez basically said to her, given her previous stance as a visceral opponent of President Putin's and of Russia's. You could come up with much stronger words to describe her general attitude. Anyway, Sanchez basically said to her, "You must be joking. The idea that you can act as our representative in negotiations to end the conflict in Ukraine is an absurd one," and there was a furious row. But anyway, the idea persisted. Stubb, who is now increasingly talking, very interesting, about the need for some kind of long-term reconciliation with the Russians, or at least rapprochement with the Russians. Probably what is driving him to do this, I should say, is growing difficulties within Finland's economy. Apparently, large stretches of the economy, large parts of the Finnish economy, which had previously thrived on the basis of the Russian trade, are now in serious trouble. And in addition, Stubb's government is coming under some criticism for the draconian approach it has taken to fortifying Finland's border with Russia, including its decision to start planting landmines across the border and to pull out of conventions in order to do that. Just saying. Anyway, Stubb, who appears to be under some political pressure, is now talking about some kind of need for a long-term reconciliation with the Russians. No one, of course, imagines that Kaja Kallas would be the person to negotiate that. And there doesn't so far seem to be any agreement as to who that European representative to negotiate with the Russians should be, except that apparently it can't be Kaja Kallas. Now, unsurprisingly, none other than Emmanuel Macron of France has now put his name forward. He says that he is the obvious person to act as the high representative of the Europeans, of the EU, and of the Euro-Atlantic countries, including Britain, of course, in discussions with the Russians. I have discussed in previous programs that Macron seems completely oblivious to the fact that he is now very, very much persona non grata in Moscow. Undoubtedly, the Russians would receive him if he were to decide to come to Moscow. Undoubtedly, Putin would speak to him over the phone if he were to pick up the phone and telephone Putin. But the Russians, over the last 3 years, have seen what Emmanuel Macron is all about, how he talks peace and prepares for war, how he runs or tries to run simultaneously with both the hare and the hounds, how he has talked about the need to respect and understand Russia's position as a European power, whilst at the same time talking about destroying Russia's economy, how he has suggested, repeatedly suggested, deployment of European troops to Ukraine, how he's managed to say incredibly insulting things about the Russian president, and about how, as the Russians have never forgotten, he wasted their time back in February 2022 in conducting diplomacy apparently intended to prevent the start of the war, the outbreak of the war, without coming up with any kind of proposal at all. In fact, I now understand that even before February 2022, the Russians were beginning to tire of Emmanuel Macron. It seems that at some point before then, Macron actually told Putin that the Minsk agreement was dead and that Russia and Putin simply needed to accept that fact and should behave as a direct party to the conflict, which at that point, of course, had not yet escalated into outright war, and negotiate directly with Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and cut out the Donbass militias and their leaders entirely, despite the fact that the Minsk agreements made it clear that it was the Donbass leaders who would be the ones who would conduct the negotiations. The Russians were absolutely furious about that. They saw that as Macron trying to push them into a corner and to undermine the entire Minsk agreement, which was still at that point in time supposedly the topic, the framework of the negotiations. And I well remember that in the autumn of 2021, the Russians circulated to France and Germany an extremely strong démarche, a statement containing very strong criticism of this stance, which it then became clear originated with Macron. Well, Macron appears to be oblivious to all of this. He pays no heed to the fact that Putin was already deeply offended by the fact that on one occasion, after the special military operation began, Macron conducted an entire telephone conversation with Putin, over the course of which he actually had the entire French media, or at least representatives of the French media, in the room with him, listening in to this supposedly private conversation between the two leaders, Putin and Macron. As I said, this isn't something you do to Vladimir Putin. And he was furious about it, and is furious about it. But nonetheless, notwithstanding all that history, Macron appears to believe that he is the man who can nonetheless conduct negotiations with the Russians, and that the Europeans should entrust to him that role. I don't know what the other European leaders think. There's been no public announcement to that effect, but both the Russians and some other officials in Europe are saying that there is no discussion yet, no actual step taken by any of the European states to actually contact the Russians, to begin those discussions and to talk to the Russians in the way that Alexander Stubb is talking about. So the idea is out there, but as always happens with the Europeans, it's all degenerated into chatter between each other. No actual decision, no concrete decision of any kind has yet been made. Far from picking up the telephone and talking to Putin, far from sending a representative to Moscow to speak to Putin and to Lavrov and to others there, far from taking any step of that nature, they're all still arguing with each other about who it should be who would do that on their behalf. And we're no further forward from that point. Notice that Macron has put himself forward, but Starmer, for the moment, has not. Maybe Starmer, on this, understands that he absolutely is persona non grata in Moscow. More likely, he can't bring himself to talk to the Russians. There's been a kind of British policy going all the way back to 2014 to avoid having discussions with the Russians. Boris Johnson briefly visited Moscow. I seem to remember at one point, meeting did not go well, as I remember. That was when Johnson was Theresa May's foreign secretary, not when Johnson was prime minister. Liz Truss undertook a disastrous visit as foreign secretary to Moscow shortly before the start of the special military operation, over the course of which she assumed that two big Russian cities, Rostov and Voronezh, were part of Ukraine, something which the Russians found alternatively preposterous and hilarious. And Ben Wallace, who was Boris Johnson's defense secretary, also briefly visited Moscow, met with Shoigu and Gerasimov, and that's about it. The British generally do not want to talk to the Russians, and Ian Proud has told me in a conversation, I don't think I'm giving away anything here, that the British embassy in Moscow is not only down to basically a skeleton staff, but apparently part of the embassy building is now shared with the embassy of another country. At least that is what I seem to remember him telling me. There is basically no diplomatic contact between Britain and Russia whatsoever. And it seems that Keir Starmer, who, to be clear, would be most unwelcome in Moscow anyway, has no interest for the moment in changing any of that. So there we are. Paralysis, lack of movement, much talk about huge increases in defense spending in Europe to try to meet the Russian threat. All the indications are of a Europe that is rapidly descending into recession, severe recession. The tariffs are going to compound that across the European economy. There is concern and agitation across Europe about whether, in light of the American tariffs, Europe must now prepare for a vast flood of Chinese products diverted from the United States towards Europe, and all sorts of talk about putting up tariff barriers to stop that huge influx of Chinese goods. One tariff barriers, by the way, which will compound the economic problems in Europe as well, given how central the Chinese are in much of the European economy and the extent to which the Chinese also supply cheap consumer goods to Europeans. Anyway, I'm going to say straight away that all the plans, all the projects for increasing defense spending that we were hearing about just a few weeks ago, not one of which has in practical and actual terms got off the ground. Probably by the end of this year, especially if gas shortages start to hit home and energy costs across the European Union and in Britain start to rise, all of that is going to evaporate and vanish like the mist. So there we are. The Europeans, nowhere at all. Britain, no real plan or project about what to do. France, with a president who's preening and continuing to consider himself a great statesperson and leader in the world, but is not recognized as such by anyone. And in Germany, I saw the latest opinion poll, which interestingly now puts the AfD and the CDU-CSU level at 24%. Merz's party, the CDU-CSU, continues to lose support in Germany. The AfD, by contrast, continues to rise. The cancellation of the debt brake and the cynical way it was done, the decision to go for arms spending and the belligerent rhetoric against the Russians, all of this in the midst of a gathering economic crisis, does not seem to be playing at all well with the German electorate. And another CDU minister-president, the minister-president of Thuringia, again in eastern Germany, has now come out and said that Germany needs urgently to restart the import of Russian pipeline gas, that this is an economic priority and one which cannot be put off indefinitely. Now, so far, all of these CDU politicians, we've now had those comments from the CDU Minister President of Saxony in Eastern Germany, and now he's been joined by the CDU Minister President of Thuringia. All of these comments are being made by CDU officials in East Germany, in the former East Germany. So far, to the best of my knowledge, no major CDU figure in the former West Germany has broken ranks with Merz. But if this decline in the support of the CDU, CSU continues, if, heaven forbid, the AfD overtakes the CDU, CSU, then the situation may change. And if there's a feeling that Merz is digging himself in, that he is pursuing economic policies and defense and foreign policies that are not adapted to the needs of the moment, that are not adapted to Germany's specific and pressing needs of today, which essentially call for some kind of rapprochement with the Russians, then I personally would not be surprised if dissent starts to spread to the CDU, CSU branches in Western Germany as well. And with the AfD now making increasing inroads there in Western Germany as well, I think the possibility of defections from the CDU, CSU to the AfD is not one that should be completely discounted. If that starts to happen, if we see some middle-ranking officials of the CDU, CSU start to cross over to the AfD, something which is not unheard of, by the way, in German politics, political leaders can sometimes move between parties, and in many respects, as has been remarked by several people, with Merz's now shift towards the AfD on the migrant issue, ideologically, there is not much fundamental difference between these two blocs. Of course, in terms of personality, in terms of policy, you could argue that there is, but the CDU, CSU is no longer making the kind of intellectual case against voting for the AfD that it once did. Well, given that that is so, if some people from the CDU start to defect to the AfD, I personally would not be surprised if it becomes a flood. The coalition that is still being negotiated between the CDU, CSU and the SPD, which Merz is supposed to lead, would have a majority of just 13 in the Bundestag, which is a real majority, but not a huge one. If pressure starts to intensify, then that majority could begin to crack and crumble, and tensions between the coalition partners could start to increase. And of course, if Merz then makes the decision that in order to stabilize the coalition, he has to reach out to the Greens, which is, by the way, by no means impossible, despite what many people suppose about him. After all, he's shown a willingness to completely reverse himself on all sorts of things. Migration issues, the debt question. Well, if he starts speaking and trying to win over the Greens, well, that will create more problems within the CDU-CSU than any that we've ever seen up to now. So it is not impossible that within a year, the whole new German coalition, the Merz government, could also be in serious trouble. Just saying. Anyway, Europe, all over the place. It's got no coherent plans. There are clear signs, it seems to me now, that some European leaders are increasingly rethinking their stance. The Serb president, Vučić, has given an interview in which he says that, to his knowledge, at least 2 European leaders, and he went out of his way to make clear that he was not talking here about Orban and Fico, Orban of Hungary and Fico of Slovakia, that to his knowledge, already for some time, 2 European leaders, he's not saying which ones, have had private discussions with the Russians, have had private contacts with Putin. It's a mystery who these people could be. Meloni in Italy might be one. Conceivably Macron might be another. It wouldn't surprise me if he was, again, as I said, playing the game of running with both the hare and the hounds at one and the same time. But anyway, cracks in the anti-Russian edifice before long might soon start to appear. Already, there is growing anxiety in Europe that, especially if the Trump administration eventually decides to side with the MAGA pragmatists, with people like Vance, Gabbard, Witkoff, and go for some kind of re-engagement with the Russians, that at that point, in July, when the sanctions, the EU sanctions, are due for rollover, that Orban and Fico might actually finally veto that rollover, bringing all of the really important sanctions to a stop. And were that to happen, it's already been pointed out that the European Union would in that case be obliged to unfreeze the block on the 240 billion euros of Russian central bank assets held in Europe, and to hand that money over and back to the Russians, to the Russian central bank. And I have to say, if that were to happen, that would be a massive embarrassment and a crisis. And for the first time since the start of this conflict, I should say that I don't think it is completely impossible. Now, the day before yesterday, I received a very interesting email, again from a source, and again I have to be very careful not to discuss who this source is. In my program yesterday, I spoke about how it seemed to me that the Trump administration was divided between 2 factions. One, a more traditional Republican, conventional, neocon faction, if you like, made up possibly of Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, Keith Kellogg, one which continues to be essentially hostile to Russia, one which is skeptical about rapprochement with Russia and with Putin, one which still wants to support Ukraine to the extent that it continues to be possible to do that, and one which basically, whilst it acknowledges that the war in Ukraine is being lost in military terms and is a drain on American resources, and for that reason should be ended, is not capable of looking beyond the idea of a freeze. It simply sees the whole matter as one in which the conflict should be frozen in with a ceasefire, with all the complicated negotiations postponed until later, and with the Europeans in the meantime given a green light to send their troops to Ukraine and to confront the Russians there. That is one faction in the administration. But I suggested also that there is another one, a much more pragmatic one that is more alive to the actual realities in Ukraine, the fact that the war is indeed being lost, the fact that the stalemate narrative, which was again repeated by General Cavoli in his testament to the Senate the other day, which I discussed yesterday, that the stalemate narrative has no reality and does not actually represent the truth of what the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine actually is. The one that also recognizes the view, the current that actually also recognizes that further sanctions against Russia are a pointless idea, that the Chinese will not enforce those sanctions. They will continue to buy Russian oil almost regardless of what the United States now chooses to do. That the United States can threaten China with further tariffs if China buys Russian oil. But the reality is that with the tariffs already in place, China is effectively disincentivized from heeding those sort of threats. That China, perceiving the United States today to be hostile to itself, its priority is going to be to forge a stronger alliance with Russia, something which the recent trip to Russia by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi illustrated, so that China will not support any further secondary tariffs or sanctions by the United States against trade in Russian oil or trade in other Russian products. Neither probably will most of the rest of the world, neither will the BRICS countries in general. The prospect, therefore, of increasing leverage, increasing pressure on Russia is not a real one. And therefore, given that the war in Ukraine is being lost, given that it is this disastrous diversion of American resources, given the leverage of the kind that is often being talked about over the Russians does not really exist, the most sensible thing for the United States to do would be to come to a terms with the Russians to end the war, terms which the Russians are proposing, which, though harsh from a Ukrainian perspective, from an American perspective, are not unreasonable because they do not impinge on American core interests. Now, I just wanted, on the last point, just make one further point. I've been reading various people. There's a piece in The Guardian today complaining about the way in which the United States up to this time has been conducting its diplomacy with Russia. Thomas Graham of the Council for Foreign Relations has said that the American approach is unbalanced. It's been putting pressure on Ukraine to make concessions to Russia, whilst it has not been putting pressure on Russia to make analogous concessions to Ukraine. But what people like Thomas Graham, and I find this surprising given his level of experience and understanding of the world and of diplomacy, what people like that don't seem to grasp is how little leverage the United States actually has over Russia in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. All the really important sanctions have already been imposed. They were imposed 3 years ago. You cannot really go beyond, in effectiveness, what has already been done. In military terms, the article that was recently published by the New York Times shows the depth of American involvement in the conflict, the extent to which the United States ultimately gave Ukraine every single weapon system that it wanted, the fact that the United States, in fact, didn't really give Ukraine those weapons. It pushed those weapons onto Ukraine because it was the United States itself that was conducting the war, to all intents and purposes, against Russia, but was nonetheless unable to win it. So given that this is so, talk about pressure and leverage over Moscow is fool's talk. It does not admit to that simple and fundamental fact that that leverage simply does not exist. Now, that brings me, by the way, as a final sub-point, to something that you always find now, especially in the British media. You find all sorts of articles. There's one by Owen Matthews, I believe, quite recently, but I've seen several others, all of which say that Russia is in this terrible condition, the economy is buckling, the inflation crisis is intensifying. In fact, and for the record, the Russian central bank has just published a very positive prospectus for the state of the economy. It claims that inflation is now starting, the inflation indicators are starting to point downward much faster than the central bank had itself anticipated. It notes a slowdown in inflation over the course of March. It also notes, by the way, as do other Russian economic actors, a slowdown in the rate of growth of the economy in February and March. Almost certainly true. And by the way, before a new narrative takes the place of the old one, that this is further proof of some kind of a crisis, slowing down the economy was what the central bank aimed to do in order to bring the inflation problem under control. The one requires the other, and the slowdown was intentionally planned. Anyway, the central bank says that the policies that it put in place last year are now working. The Russian government is in the process of conducting a policy of budget consolidation, that inflation is coming down, that the economy is cooling and cooling successfully, that the shortages, the labor shortages across the economy are abating, that there is no longer the same intensity in the labor market that there was, the same stress in the labor market that there was a few months ago. And that overall, the Russian economy is moving back towards a path of balanced, non-inflationary growth. Non-inflationary growth, in the central bank's view, is growth which takes place against an annual inflation rate of 4%, that being the central bank's target. Anyway, I got myself diverted, but these are important points to recall. Anyway, there is this view that one reads in some parts of the media, particularly the British media, that the situation in Russia is absolutely terrible. The Russian army has suffered these astronomical losses. There are shortages of equipment. The infantry is degrading, which is what General Cavoli was telling the Senate. And the economy in Russia is under extreme stress and is massively overheating and all of that. And for that reason, all we need to do is to hold out just a little bit longer, because in reality, Putin is desperate for a ceasefire. I read about 5 different articles in different sections of the British media that make that very claim. And then alongside those articles, there's a whole set of other articles which say that the Russians aren't really interested in ending the war, that they're simply spinning out the negotiations, that the Kremlin has a cynical approach to the negotiations, that it wants the war to continue, that Putin is not prepared to retreat from his maximalist goals, and that fundamentally means that Putin himself is not prepared to negotiate any kind of compromise of any kind with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. There doesn't seem to be any awareness in Britain that these two narratives, one about Putin being on his last legs, desperate for a ceasefire which allows him to keep what he's got without facing defeat and humiliation, and the other of Putin, the implacable, determined to go on fighting until final victory, and apparently feeling confident that he can do so. There doesn't seem to be any awareness that these two narratives are in fundamental contradiction to each other. But just to repeat again, the reality is the United States does have leverage over Ukraine. It can put significant pressure over the Ukrainians, as the Americans did prior to the meeting with the Ukrainians in Jeddah, where they cut off arms supplies and intelligence and isolated the Ukrainian delegation from its European friends and kept Zelensky away and strong-armed the Ukrainians into committing to a ceasefire. But the Americans have no analogous leverage. They have no pressure points that they can put on the Russians. If they try to do so, it will backfire on them, and it will simply lose the Americans more friends around the world, because it will be seen as more examples of America piling on economic pressure on other countries. And of course, in military terms, well, the leverage there was lost a long, long time ago. So there doesn't seem to be that recognition. But anyway, I was talking yesterday about how the neocons seem to be pushing back. But as I said, I received a very interesting email from a source which discussed the sort of discussions that apparently the Americans and the Russians, the more MAGA side, the Americans on the more MAGA side of the picture, Vance, Gabbard, Witkoff. Witkoff is clearly the main point man. Were having with Dmitriev and other like-minded Russians about how to move things forward. And I speculated some programs ago that given the European Union's implacable refusal to relax any sanctions against Russia at all, even those sanctions that would enable the restart of the grain deal, the Black Sea Initiative, something that the Russians have insisted upon in order to get the grain the Black Sea Initiative, the grain deal, back in action. I suggested that the United States and Russia, perhaps rather than try to strong-arm the Europeans into lifting these sanctions, which would be extremely difficult and might not work, a better plan might be for the United States and Russia to work things out with each other. I said that perhaps accounts could be established in American banks to receive payments for Russian food and fertilizer products that are sold on global markets, that mechanisms could be found for those American banks to then transfer the funds to Russia. I suggested this could be done perhaps in the old way through promissory notes and things of that kind. I suggested that American companies, America of course has a huge insurance industry of its own, that American insurers might be persuaded to extend insurance to Russian ships or ships transporting Russian fertilizer and agricultural products. There's no reason why all of this has to be done through European institutions. There's no reason why things like that would need, for example, to be done through the Lloyd's insurance market in London. The United States has ample resources to provide that insurance. Of course, so does Russia. But in some places, for some ships, some ship owners would probably prefer American insurance to Russian, simply because American insurance would ensure that ships would not be at risk on the high seas, for example. And I suggested that this might happen. Well, this very interesting email that I got, and it was a very interesting one, actually said that discussions of exactly that nature are indeed underway. And there was discussions, for example, about how funds could be transferred from the United States to Russia if there was sanctions relaxation in the United States, which is in the Trump administration's gift. And there was references to blockchain as a technology that could be used to facilitate payments. All kinds of things. Now, I don't want to discuss, again, where this source obtained his information. I should say that some of it came from Russian sources, but there were also some sources which could be construed as American as well. I would not be surprised if discussions like this were indeed underway, which is not to say, by the way, that these discussions will come to fruit and that an agreement to do these things will be reached. Ultimately, it depends on the interplay between the factions in Washington, whether the neocons win out over the MAGA people and which side Donald Trump himself comes down on. Just to say. So anyway, this would be, however, a major event if it were to happen, if the United States were to take action which basically negates European sanctions. That would be a horrifying thing for the leaders of Europe. Starmer, Macron, Ursula and Merz would be profoundly shocked. In Britain, an American step that essentially undermines the already fraying preeminence in shipping insurance of the Lloyd's insurance market, which has declined radically in my lifetime, just to say. I mean, back in the 60s, pretty much any ship around the world obtained its insurance in London. That is far from the case today, but Lloyd's still plays an outsized role in maritime insurance. If the Americans start providing their own insurance separately from Lloyd's, that is the end of Lloyd's. That is the end of London's position at the centre of maritime insurance. A history going back to the 12th century, and I'm not exaggerating here, will have ended. Lloyd's, of course, does not itself go back to the 12th century, but London's centrality in all issues involving maritime law and insurance does. Anyway, that will be a colossal blow to the City of London. And, of course, it's be interesting to see how the Starmer government responds to all of that. But anyway, and of course, if the Americans start taking these steps, then as night follows day, the demands in Germany to start importing Russian gas again via pipelines, to come to some kind of settlement with the Russians over Ukraine, to end the militarization. Those calls, which are already there and getting louder, will massively magnify. And at that point also, even if some European leaders want to continue with the sanctions, or at least sanctions in some form, I cannot imagine people like Orban and Fico continuing to support rollover of the sanctions. And I strongly suspect that other leaders, quite plausibly Meloni in Italy, Meloni is clearly now distancing herself as much as she can, as fast as she can, from the whole Ukraine project. Meloni of Italy, perhaps, could start to vote against sanctions extensions also. So everything hangs on a thread. I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that the world, the tariff world, the world of tariffs that Donald Trump has inaugurated, the end of globalization, which even Keir Starmer is talking about, the end of the rules-based international order, going back to his words, the new world is less governed by established rules. The end of the rules-based international order and all that. Well, all of that inevitably means that Ukraine, the conflict there, which for so long, for so many years, going well back beyond the start of the 2022 crisis, going all the way back arguably to 2014 and the Maidan coup, that now has indeed been relegated to a sideshow. Increasingly, it is going to become impossible to keep this at the center of people's attention, as so many other much greater, much more pressing things start to weigh down on people. A few individuals who remain obsessed with this issue, like Keir Starmer, who writes a whole article in the Daily Telegraph about how to respond to the new post-globalization crisis that Britain's economy faces, with a whole paragraph about Ukraine. A few people like that will continue to be obsessed by it. But before very long, they are going to be reduced to a very, very small minority. Finishing again on this whole topic with Keir Starmer, this article, with its mania, its obsession with Ukraine, to my mind, what it shows is how out of date and out of touch Starmer himself is rapidly becoming. The arch globalist is going to lead Britain into the new world post-globalism. The man who remains fixated with Ukraine is going to resolve the massive and growing problems of the British economy. Already doubts about Starmer are growing even within his own party. And I would have thought that before long, in a couple of months' time, at most, those doubts are going to become increasingly visible. And criticism, which is already bubbling just beneath the surface, is going to grow. It's most unusual for the Labour Party to remove its prime ministers from office during the period of a parliament, especially after they've won a landslide victory in an election. I, for one, would have thought there's a very good chance now that Keir Starmer will be the exception, in fact, the precedent that breaks the rule. Anyway, I think at this point it's useful, however, to return to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine, what's actually happening on the battlefronts. And, well, over the last couple of programs, both here and on the Duran, I and my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou have been talking about a Russian offensive, a big Russian offensive which is in preparation. Zelensky and his people have been talking about it. There's been some murmurs about it in Russia itself. Putin has dropped a very heavy hint that such an offensive may be in preparation. Well, it's interesting because I said that I thought that such an offensive might begin in May. This is my own view about this. Some Ukrainian military people have speculated it could begin in July, August. Others still have suggested late April. Well, if you actually look at the situation over the last couple of days on the battlefronts, one might, if one looked at the situation closely, conclude that all of these views are wrong. Because over the last couple of days, since the warm weather basically started, it almost looks as if the offensive is already underway. We are starting to see major Russian advances on multiple locations. And as I discussed in a recent program, these advances are taking place all across the front lines. Every part of the front lines now, we see a Russian advance. Now, last night, and before I turn to the actual events on the actual front lines, last night there was another major Russian combined missile and drone strike across Ukraine. Now, the Russians for the moment appear to be abiding with the truce, the 30-day truce, precluding attacks on Ukraine's energy system. But lots of other facilities were attacked as well. And a major attack, a major focus of the attack was the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. And interestingly and importantly, it looks as if Ukrainian air defenses were caught short and basically collapsed. According to the Ukrainians themselves, the Ukrainians only managed to shoot down 13 out of 23 Russian missiles that were launched against them. Probably they are overestimating their success in terms of the missiles that they have shot down anyway. But even they admit that only just over half of the missiles that the Russians launched were actually shot down. And it seems that by Ukraine's own admission, most of the drones, the Uranium-2 drones that were launched, got through as well and struck their targets. And we're talking now, from what I can see, about perhaps hundreds of drones. Now, for the moment, I am not able to say what exactly it was that the Russians hit. And the most interesting thing about this attack is that it was carried out by different missiles and different drones operating in complex patterns. Russian attacks on Ukraine have now become extremely sophisticated, far more sophisticated than they were in the winter of 2022-2023, when the Russians first began their combined missile strikes across Ukraine. And it does seem, or so it seems to me, that the Russians no longer conduct or rely so much on air-launched cruise missiles in order to conduct their strikes. And it's not difficult now to understand why. Because what used to happen was when Russian bombers, Tupolev F-95 bombers and Tupolev F-22 M3 bombers took off, the American intelligence was able to give the Ukrainians significant warning that a big Russian missile strike was coming, and that gave the Ukrainian air defense system roughly 1 to 3 hours, there's been many different claims, to prepare for the missile strike. Now, the Russians don't rely on air-launched cruise missiles to anything like the same degree. I think I understand that some air-launched missiles were used in this latest attack, but they appear to have been Kinzhal hypersonic missiles launched by MiG-31s, which the Ukrainians, well, in my opinion, basically cannot intercept or have immense difficulties intercepting. Most of the missiles that were launched were either launched from the ground. There were various types of Iskander missiles, and it is clear that Russian ballistic missiles, ground-launched ballistic missiles, not only are available in far greater numbers than was the case earlier in the war, but they also have the ability to reach targets far further inside Ukraine than had been true earlier in the war. Their range appears to have significantly increased. Also, a significant amount of missiles were launched by the Russian Navy from the Black Sea, mostly apparently Calibre, subsonic cruise missiles, though allegedly the Calibre has been significantly modified and has become much more stealthy than it was earlier in the war. But possibly, maybe, Zircon hypersonic missiles were also launched. Cruise missiles were launched as well. Anyway, it's difficult to say exactly how many missiles were launched and what sort of missiles they were. The Russian Defense Ministry never provides us with those kind of breakdowns. No doubt in time we will find out, but there's been lots of pictures of missiles crashing into targets in Kiev, lots of explosions and fires. There's been attacks on all sorts of other places. There was some talk a few days ago about a pause in Russian drone and missile strikes and of an analogous Ukrainian pause. Well, that's all ended now, and the Russians are back, and they're hitting targets across Ukraine, and once again hitting those targets with ever greater intensity. And I said that the calibres have become more sophisticated and that the drone tactics have become much more sophisticated. It seems as if Russian production of Uranium-2 drones is now running into hundreds a day, just saying. It also seems as if at least some of these drones now have guidance and can actually be guided onto their targets by controllers like FPV drones. So the Ukrainians now have that problem to contend with as well. Anyway, a major Russian combined missile and drone strike against Ukraine. And note that over the last couple of days, we've been hearing a lot less about analogous Ukrainian drone strikes against Russia. Anyway, that what happened over the course of last night, but it's also happening alongside further news of Russian advances across the battlefronts. And they are taking place everywhere now across the battlefronts. Now, there's been reports, well, it's now clear that a group of forces, Dnieper, this very large Russian formation in Kherson and Zaporozhye region, the one led by General Templinsky, one of Russia's most capable generals, and a formation that has been mostly idle for the last year, that they're now very busy. They are advancing and appear to be working towards the capture of this village of Kamenska, which looks like it's been largely Kamenska, which has largely been surrounded. But the Russians also appear to have captured other locations. And I discussed yesterday in my program that it is now becoming increasingly clear that in the next few weeks, the major Russian attack in this area, in the Kherson-Zaporozhye region, is going to be the Ukrainian town, the town of Orekhov, which is the base of Ukraine's failed, disastrous, defeated 2023 summer offensive. Kamenska, Orekhov, both captured, would open a front for the Russians against the city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper. And if the Russians actually were to capture Kamenska, they would actually be very close now to the Dnieper itself. Now, there's been all kinds of reports of further Russian advances in southwestern Donbass. I'm going to skip over those. This appears to be, for the moment, the most dynamic area of the battlefield of all. It's the area where the Russians are advancing fastest. The Russians, a couple of days ago, announced that they'd captured the important village of Uspenska near Pokrovsk. There are reports that they have pushed the Ukrainians out or away from another village in that area called Solona. The Russians had captured Solona. The Ukrainians then tried to recapture it. There's fighting been going on, but the Ukrainians have been pushed back. And it looks as if in this whole area, Kotlino, Udachny, Uspenska, Shevchenko, Pishanye, that the Russians now are once again back on the attack, attacking not towards Pokrovsk, but attacking westwards, outflanking Pokrovsk to the west, and apparently working to significantly expand their area of control. There have been lots of reports over the last 24 hours of significant Russian advances in this area, of more villages being captured, of more tree lines and fields falling under Russian control. I'm not going to pretend that I followed every detail. If you want to go to the various maps, Suriyak and the others, you can probably find them all there. But the point is that the Russians, the pace of the Russian advance in this area, alongside the advance further south in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, appears to be intensifying and appears now to be reaching the same dynamism that we saw last spring and summer. And already this is serious news for the Ukrainians. The problem is that they are facing the same problems everywhere else as well. Now, I mentioned how the Russians have pushed forward, pushed the Ukrainians out of Toretsk again, captured villages to the west of Toretsk, the salient that the Ukrainians still held in that area, with all these villages, places like Alexandropil and Pantelinovka, that appears to have been essentially extinguished. There's been some news this morning about the situation in Chasiv Yar. Now, I said that there were reports that the Ukrainian forces in central Chasiv Yar have been essentially cut off. Well, the reports now speak of the Russians controlling areas north and west, all of north and areas north and west of the central area of Chasiv Yar, which appears to confirm that the Ukrainians are indeed cut off in that area. It also speaks of the Ukrainians controlling only several high-rise buildings still in the center of Chasiv Yar, of the Ukrainians clinging on to one other built-up area, from what I can understand, to the southwest of Chasiv Yar, and to, I think it was a railway station, a little further to the west, perhaps connected to this built-up area that I was speaking about. There is also, however, confirmation that Syrskyi and Zelensky are now becoming so concerned about the apparent collapse of Ukrainian positions in the Chasiv Yar area and the Konstantinovka, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk area, that all available Ukrainian sources are being rapidly transferred there to try to hold the line, and that that is now increasingly coming at the price of successful resistance in other places. Pokrovsk, southwestern Donbass, Zaporozhye, wherever. It looks as if, for Zelensky at least, control of the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka has again become, for him personally, an issue of personal prestige. And I suspect that he also fears that if the Russians capture these three cities and Pokrovsk, but especially these three cities even more than Pokrovsk, the Russians will be, in effect, in control of the whole of Donbass, and that will put the Russians in a stronger position to tell the Americans, well, look, there's no sense in backing the Ukrainians about their refusal to give up territory in the four regions, because the most important territory, the built-up area in northern Donbass, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, is now under our control. And before long, Zaporozhye city will be also. So it could be that this is why Zelensky in particular is so focused on clinging on to these cities, and why troops from across Ukraine are being sent there. Anyway, that's the situation in that area. It looks like a mighty battle is about to happen, but the Russians are clearly on the advance and clearly hold the initiative. Even as the situation around Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka deteriorates, it looks as if the Russians have now not only expanded the areas of control around the Jerebets and Oskol rivers, but that they are now very close to Liman itself. Apparently they've captured some villages immediately to the north of Liman. I'm not exactly certain where, but anyway, those are the reports, north of Liman. Liman, of course, is one of the small towns that could be described as a satellite town of Slavyansk. And they have further significantly expanded even beyond what I was discussing yesterday. Their area of control west of the Oskol River in the village of Kamienka, which there are reports that they now control a significant part, and which everyone expects will fall completely under their control fairly soon. And lastly, in the Kursk area, pictures have appeared showing the Russian soldiers in the village hall of Goyevo, one of the last remaining villages where the Ukrainians have a presence in Kursk region, or had a presence in Kursk region. The troops there were essentially surrounded, apparently, or at least those were the claims. But it looks as if that battle is almost ended. The Russians have now confirmed, that Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that Basovka in Sumy region has also fallen under Russian control, and that they are now closing in on the last remaining village in Kursk region that the Ukrainians still cling onto. And, well, there's also been reports, which I'm not going to pretend again I'm fully up to date with, but apparently there is an area also to the east of the Oskol River where the Russians seem to be working towards entrapping a significant Ukrainian force, including elements of the 3rd Azov Brigade, just to say, east of the Oskol River, near to a place called Baranova. Anyway, one can spend a huge amount of time dwelling on the details, but it looks to me as if the Russian advance has already to a great extent begun. And as I said, its overall dynamism appears to be similar to what we saw in the summer. Once the bigger Russian forces are committed, perhaps that dynamism will grow. But I cannot see anywhere along the front lines, where the situation any longer is static, or anywhere where the Russians do not hold the initiative. The Ukrainians continue to occupy some territory in Belgorod region, near the villages of Demidovka and Popovka. Supposedly up to 6,000 Ukrainian troops are in that area, fighting group of forces north. There's been all sorts of explanations and reasons as to why those Ukrainian troops are there. I find it all completely bizarre. With Ukraine facing an operational crisis, I would have thought that those 6,000 troops that Ukraine cannot afford to misuse in this way ought to be redeployed someplace else, but there we are. Now, I've discussed the military situation in some detail. I suspect that it's going to start to get a lot worse for Ukraine over the next few weeks. I suspect that in 2 or 3 weeks' time, the fact that we are again looking at a dynamic battlefield and a Russian advance is going to start to hit home. And that, again, as happened in late spring, summer of last year, alarm and panic across Europe is going to grow. But last year, we still had basically a united collective West. Nobody can pretend that we do today. And to repeat again, one way or the other, I suspect that Ukraine, the conflict there, important as it will continue to be, nonetheless will become a matter of less and less concern for people in the West, most people in the West, and by some point will come to seem like a sideshow. Well, this is my program for today. We'll see how things develop over the next few weeks. The key decisions, it seems to me, will continue to be made in Washington for the next few weeks and months. I think this is the last key period in history, in modern history, where it will be decisions made in Washington that determine the future. I suspect that in 5-10 years' time, we won't be just in a post-globalist world. We will be outside, we will have left behind us, once and for all, the so-called American century. That grandiose project launched by some people in the United States in the 1940s. But anyway, we still have some way to go before that fully plays out. We will see which side America comes down on in Ukraine, and of course increasingly key decisions also shaping the future of the world continue to be made in Moscow and also of course in Beijing. Well, those are my comments for today. Tomorrow I'm going to see if I can find time to return to the Middle East, where Israel does indeed seem to be beginning its ground offensive in Gaza. So anyway, this is my program for today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.